All right, here we go. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another live stream from the Christian Comic Art Society. My name is Joffrey Strout, and tonight we are joined by comic book illustrator, writer, and art educator Al Nickerson for a live stream interview and discussion about his creative journey using comic book stories to entertain and inspire. Al Nickerson is the writer and artist of superhero Christian graphic novels, An Act of Faith, and The Sword of Eden. He has worked as a comic book artist for DC Comics and Archie Comics, as well as working as a designer and animator for Sesame Street, MTV Animation, and Nickelodeon. Al also teaches a class on creating comic books and comic strips at the SUNY Orange College in New York. He is the founder of Messianic Comics, a Christian comic book company bringing Christian comics and graphic novels to fans of all ages. If you have any questions for our guest, please leave them in the comments and we'll do our best to respond to those where time permits. So, welcome Al, thank you for joining us.
You're very welcome. Happy to be here. Well, I'm at my place, but virtually it's nice to be here.
Virtually together, yes. So you're an artist, an illustrator, an art educator. How did you get started on your creative journey?
You want the long version or the short version? Because the thing is, since I was a kid, I was always very interested in comics and in animation. I think when I was like 12, I realized I could actually make a living or would want to make a living drawing comics. And I think by the time I was in high school, I really took that very seriously. And there were comic book artists like Frank Miller and Klaus Janson and John Byrne and Terry Austin, whose work I really enjoyed. And especially like Terry Austin, he was an inker for Marvel. And all the stuff he did with John Byrne on the X-Men was just like fantastic. I realized all the inking that Terry Austin had done just looked better than everybody else's stuff. So I really was focused on inking. And I went to the School of Visual Arts after high school. I was there for 4 years and I had some really great teachers there. And I, learned how to draw comics and inking and that sort of thing. And then after that, for a couple of years, I was doing graphic design work and I started working professionally in comics in 1994. So I had some really great teachers, Will Eisner and Sal Amendola and Erwin Hasten and Harvey Kurtzman and Gene Colan. And those guys were great.
Yeah, like Will Eisner is one of my all-time faves. He's amazing. It must have been really something to work with him. He's kind of
I totally agree. And the last 3 years of my time at SVA, Will was my teacher. And my last year, my fourth year, I had 2 of his classes. And he was great. He was awesome. I think I wish I kind of appreciated it a little bit more back then when I was younger, because now he's gone, but I have very fond memories of Will. He was a great teacher, really focused on business and comics as a literary and as well as an art form.
Yeah, like some of his work that I've read it's inspiring to see how seriously he took the form and he wanted other people to.
And that's exactly how he was in the classroom. He was all business. He took everything comics making very seriously. Yeah, and he was so optimistic about the form, and he was always looking ahead too. So he was a great guy.
Yeah, man, that's a huge privilege. I wish I'd been able to do the same thing.
I wish I could do it again.
Yeah. So you were working in comics full time. So did you start at DC Comics, at Archie Comics? Was that the?
No, I started at Warp Graphics. I was an inker on a book called ElfQuest: Blood of 10 Chiefs. So I did that for about a year. So it's like all the ElfQuest stuff, the elves and the wolves and running through the woods and stuff.
Yeah.
And which was fine. It was a huge blessing because I always wanted to work in comics since I was like a teenager and stuff. And God has always blessed my career and it was wonderful. So I worked for ElfQuest. And then I got into animation for a little while and I worked for MTV Animation and Nickelodeon. And then I got back into comics again after I was an animator at Sesame Street. So after that, then I got back into comics and I started working at DC Comics in 2001 in like June or July.
Okay. Oh. Mm-hmm. So did anything stick out to you in DC Comics, like the experience there? Like, how would you characterize that? Was that?
It was pretty good. I mean, considering, it was great. I think out of all the publishers I've ever worked for, in regards to like Archie and DC and Marvel, DC probably treated me the best. They paid well, right? So their page rate was really good. And they returned my artwork, which was nice. And they were very flattering, which was nice. And it's always nice when people say nice things about you. So they were great. So when I was working for DC, I was working for DC and Archie Comics at the same time, and that lasted for like 8.5 years.
Okay.
So yeah, they both kept me very busy.
Wow. Yeah. So you were primarily inking for them?
Yeah, so all the comic book stuff during that time when I was doing work for hire was all inking. So yeah, for Marvel, DC, and Archie, I was an inker.
Okay. All right. And you're during that time, like you get to work with Eisner. Was there anyone that particularly influenced you as you were in that process? Like that became, I imagine you got to work with people that were, some people that might be pretty influential. Did anybody rub off on you? Then like your style kind of took on some similarities, or?
Yeah, well, I guess my style has always been kind of cartoony, and then as an animator, it was really cartoony looking. So when I was working at DC, they gave me all the Cartoon Network books like Justice League Unlimited, Justice League Adventures, and Hi Hi Puffy Amiyumi, and Crypto the Super Dog, and Cartoon Network Block Party. I think that was the name of it. Wow. But there were people that inspired me artistically. I had mentioned like John Byrne, Terry Austin, Frank Miller, and Klaus Janson, and Will Eisner, of course. And when I got older, I really appreciated, Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. So all those guys, all their art styles really did influence my work. When I was working for the publishers, I mean, I worked with a lot of great guys that I was quite fond of. If you're asking me if I ever worked for like any of these legends that I just mentioned, the answer would probably be no. I never got a chance to work with like John Byrne or Frank Miller or those guys, Okay. So, but the guys I worked with, at Marvel and DC and Archie, yeah, they were mostly really great.
That's cool. Yeah. So you mentioned, we were talking earlier, you mentioned that there was some aspects of the comics business world that were not that were not something that worked well, that you experienced as like a not good experience. Do you want to talk about any of those, or how that impacted you in your creative journey?
Well, what I tell my students is that, if you want to work for Disney or Marvel or whomever, it's all work made for hire. So you're working on properties that you don't own yourself. So they belong to somebody else. So if you want to do that, that's fine. But you got to understand the history of comics. So, within the history of comics, some of these publishers did not treat their artists and writers very well. Like the way that Jack Kirby was treated, or Steve Ditko, or Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster, or Wally Wood. In my opinion, they were treated quite poorly. So what I tell my students is that if they want to do work made for hire, they're not going to own anything that they work on for like Disney, for example. But if that's fine with them, then that's totally cool. You just got to understand the environment in which you're working and understand things like the business side of comics, as well as, contracts and stuff. And I never learned anything about contracts when I was in school. Like I learned all about contracts when I actually started working in comics and in animation. So you got to be a smart business person if you want to survive in, entertainment and comics specifically.
Yeah, well, it seems like, I don't know if art schools are changing, but it seemed like at least at the point when I went, there was very little discussion of the business side of art. Mostly it was like, here's how to make the images. And it seemed like I heard people talking about how it would be a really valuable thing for the art schools to focus on the business side of the art, to try to help the artists navigate that aspect, because it's pretty important. So for those who may not understand the distinction between work for hire, or what that would mean in terms of the impact business-wise, can you give a little synopsis of how would that change the experience of the working artist to work for hire versus not?
Well, there's a couple of things. So if you're doing work made for hire, one, like I said before, you don't own those characters. Like I never owned Jughead or the Justice League or anything like that. So that's owned by somebody else. And also you're not really a full-time employee. You're like a contractor. So you're self-employed. So another aspect of that is that you work from home. You got to pay your own taxes and that sort of thing. And, you don't have any medical benefits or anything like that. So, you got to keep all that stuff in mind. But there are a lot of artists that just want to draw, and they don't have a whole lot that they want to say or have to say. And if that's what they want to do, that's totally cool. But if there are artists out there that have a story they want to tell, or a character that they want to create, if they bring that to a publisher, like these the larger comic book publishers, they're not going to own those properties or that material. So just you got to be smart about things.
Yeah. So, since so many people are focused on the films these days, the cinematic versions, like it's one of the aspects of like if somebody were some character became super popular in the movie version, the creators who made them, if they created them as a work for hire, they wouldn't get any additional benefit, right?
Well, it depends. Like Jack Kirby had no contract with Marvel prior to 1971, so he created or co-created all these characters in the 1960s.
Yeah.
So, so the Kirby estate sued Marvel and Disney and Sony, and that case was about to be heard supposedly by the Supreme Court. Like the Supreme Court was deciding whether they wanted to hear that case or not. But both parties settled out of court. And but we're not privy to that information in regards to the settlement, because usually there's a non-disclosure agreement in those types of contracts. Right. So yeah, but there's, I can talk, like I talk a lot about this in the classroom. So yeah, there's a lot of things to discuss. Like Marv Wolfman sued Marvel over Blade. Got the guy who created Ghost Rider who's suing Marvel as well, because they didn't feel like they were getting properly compensated for the millions and millions of dollars that these companies were making through the films and TV shows.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just be careful. That's my advice.
So if you were an independent creator, would you recommend trying to find somebody who is business savvy to work with, or an entertainment lawyer or something like that?
Well, I would just educate yourself, read up on the history of comics and read up on the business side of things. But the thing is, like, this stuff doesn't happen in mainstream publishing. So if you go to Scholastic or Simon & Schuster or whatever with a book idea and they publish it, you retain copyright and trademark of that material. So it's just that weird thing that you see in comics, it's very bizarre. But yeah, educate yourself. That would be my best advice on that.
Yeah, that makes sense. All right. So since you've been, you sort of walked the path of being involved in the actual, world of big name comics and small, like, it seems like that you may have run into some myths that are, that are out there. Like sometimes there's the expectation and the reality, and there's things that people say, and then you get to see how it actually plays out. Are there any things that you saw in your time in comics that were not what you expected, that sort of ran in the face of what you?
I think I was pretty well educated on what the environment I was about to get into. I think that there was one publisher's contract which wasn't all that great. It was quite lengthy. I think it was like 7 or 8 pages. Their work made for hire contract, and I was kind of naive because I thought I could actually change things, and I didn't. But I think I had a, this isn't, I don't know how interesting this story is, but when I was working for Marvel, I was inking a series called Spider-Man Mysteries. So it was like a kid's book featuring Spider-Man. So, I inked like 3 issues, but at one point they thought that the image of Spider-Man's head on one of the covers, that Spider-Man's eyes were too big and looked too cartoony. So after we actually worked on the cover, they wanted to change that. So, my editor called me up. He asked me if I could come in and take, get the artwork and just make some fixes on it. And so I just brought all my inking material with me, all my pens and nibs and ink and everything. And I made the changes there in the Marvel bullpen. So if you're like a fan of Marvel, you always hear about the Marvel bullpen. So for maybe 30 seconds, I thought it was quite awesome, but it was just like this room with like these little cubicles and like all these kids who were like interns and stuff working at Marvel and making fixes on all the artwork. And they were just talking about the new Godzilla movie at the time, so for a little while it was kind of neat. I, redrew the Spider-Man head and put smaller eyes on him and gave it to my editor and went back home to, Jersey City. So, yeah, so that's the only thing that I could think of in regards to your question. So, yeah, it was like,
Okay. Yeah, that's cool. You got to see behind the scenes.
Yeah, it was very, a bit of a letdown.
Yeah, sometimes it's you know, things get built up. It's hard to see the reality.
Oh, absolutely. Especially like if you're a Marvel fan, you always like for years growing up, you hear about the Marvel bullpen and stuff.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. All right. Well, hey, let's shift gears a little bit. And if I'm curious if there's any spiritual connections that you find in your work, or that have you've worked into your work on purpose, or just ways in which you see your work has expressed or addressed themes that are eternally significant.
Well, I think that there's, well, here's a couple things. You know, for all of my work for higher career, yeah, it was all secular stuff. And it was a huge blessing. Like God blessed me, and I was able to work for all the publishers I wanted to work for. And, you know, it was fine. You know, I can't do it ever again. I can't go back doing that. I did it. It was great. God bless me. It was wonderful. But, you know, comics, or as Will Eisner called it, sequential art, is a very powerful literary form. It's a very powerful art form where important ideas and stories should be told. And Will's thing was that, you know, he really respected comics and graphic novels that had life lessons in them. So for me, like, there's nothing more important about a life lesson than the actual gospel message. So having this opportunity where I'm self-publishing the Sword of Eden graphic novel series, I'm creating content that is superhero, but it has very strong Christian themes in it, and it has the gospel message in it. And I'm creating content also for Christians that are, you know, might not be, you know, because like when I go into a comic book store, I just see a lot of stuff that I really can't read. A lot of the comics nowadays tend to be very, you know, racy and woke, and it's just not my thing. So doing something like the Sword of Eden, not only am I sharing the gospel, I'm creating content for Christian readers that they can read the graphic novel and feel like they're not compromising, you know, God's principles, and they can read something that, you know, is safe to read and that they actually really enjoy.
Okay. So it sounds like the audience you're trying to shoot for is primarily Christian. Is that, do you feel like that's the main audience for your book, or do you feel like the story could reach people who are in the mainstream audience as well?
Well, when I thought about stuff like this, I kind of had like a twofold mission. So yeah, I wanted to create Christian content for Christians, but I also wanted to share the gospel to a very lost world. And, you know, so initially I was doing signings at churches, and the books being sold through christianbook.com and, you know, eBay and Amazon and such, and a chain of bookstores up in New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. So initially that was what was really happened, like automatically, just naturally. But now that, you know, so Diamond Comic Distributors has decided to sell the book in Christian, not Christian, but regular secular comic book stores, which is great. So that's a new audience for me as well. So in that case, so then like once that happens, then yeah, I just did everything I needed to do, right? So I'll have like two different audiences out there. So yeah, so if you go into a comic book store in November when the book is out, yeah, it'll be on there with, you know, X-Men and Batman and all that other stuff. So.
That's nice. So do you find that like do you think there's any content, the way you present the content or specific content you include that might appeal to a Christian but might do the opposite to like a more secular audience? Is there anything that you think that might kind of work against the secular audience?
I don't know. I mean, you can't create artwork, you can't create art or tell a story and be worried about how your audience is going to really, if they're going to be offended or not, because you're going to constantly self-censor your work. So I just tell the kind of stories that I want to tell. And for, you know, I haven't gotten any negative feedback, and people have been great. Readers have been great and very supportive. Yeah, I'm sure if somebody who is not a Christian, who's not saved, who's not born again, and if they pick up the Sword of Eden, they might like it, they might not like it. You know, I don't know. And it's really about the Savior. So Jesus said, you know, if the world hates you, remember it hated me first. So, you know, I can't control something like that. So, but right. Yeah, if you like fun superhero stuff, yeah, give it a read.
Okay. One of our audience members has asked the question, how do you market your comic? There don't seem to be a lot of avenues for marketing Christian comics. Do you have any tips or thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's weird. I was talking to a guy who's actually going to college about for business. So I was actually talking to him about this stuff, and his advice, which I think is very true, is that social media, just Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, get your let people know through those platforms, that type of social media. I think that that's probably kind of the best bet. It'll reach a larger audience, because I have like a couple thousand people following me on Facebook, and yeah, it's great. I'm not quite sure, you know, the Christian market itself. I mean, there are a couple of Christian book distributors, so I've been talking to a few of them, but they don't really seem to be so big on Christian graphic novels, other than something like the Action Bible, which was actually a great book,
Right.
was sold very, very well, and I wish that some of these Christian comic book stores will take a chance with other Christian graphic novels.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, Morningstar Christian Bookstore in New England, they have a chain of bookstores, so they're selling the Sword of Eden up there. So you just got to contact people, even if you have to contact bookstores on your own, like bookstore by bookstore. Just send them an email, let them know what you're working on, send them a little synopsis of the story of the book and some artwork, and if they're interested, they might just buy the book directly from you. But eBay, Amazon, especially Amazon, you got to get on Amazon. So, and a lot of people go there to buy their books. And churches, just I did several signings at churches. I did signings at like small secular comic conventions as well. I'm going to the New York Comic Con in October, hopefully.
Right.
Well, I got approved for my professional badge again, but there's this whole thing with de Blasio and being vaccinated and stuff, and we'll see how that works out.
Yeah. Yeah. Everything's up in the air right now.
Yeah, it is. So, and even the New York Comic Con is not quite sure how they're going to handle that just yet. But if they're force people to be vaccinated prior to attending the New York Comic Con, then that's definitely gonna be a problem for me. So,
Yeah.
I hope I answered that question.
Seems like it to me. If anyone has any questions or needs more clarification, just add it in the comments there.
Yeah, you got to be a smart business person if you want to, have a career in art.
Yeah. Someone asked if you have a website to get your book from.
Yeah, theswordofeden.com. So there's videos there, and you could there are links to purchase the Sword of Eden at eBay, Amazon, through PayPal, as well as christianbook.com. And yeah, if you've got a Christian book, you should contact christianbook.com. Those guys are great. They even pay for shipping, which is awesome. So I just mailed them a big box of 74 copies of the Sword of Eden, and they were wonderful. They were great. And now working with Diamond again is great. So I'm looking forward to that, and getting the graphic novel in secular comic book stores as well. So it's very exciting, Jeff.
Yeah, that's great. It sounds like a lot of things are happening. That's
yeah. And but you got to, like I said, not only do you have to be a smart business person if you want to succeed and make a living in art, but you got to want to like it. But it's weird, man, because like when I talk to my students, some of them will say, well, the best part was, of the course was talking about business and stuff. But mostly artists, they don't want to talk about business. They just want to draw. So they don't want to think about, contracts and copyright and trademark and all that sort of stuff. But yeah, if you want to do it, make a living at it, you got to really understand all those things.
Yeah. Yeah. That's the whole side.
Yeah. I love it. So yeah, it's fine.
That's great. I'm actually, I'm the typical artist. I would love if someone else would just do all the business stuff for me. But I was talking to one guy's, I think Kazu Kibuishi, the guy who did the Amulet series. And what was really cool was he was talking about how a lot of the artists often will often propose the relationship between the artists and the business people, like in an antagonistic way, right? Where it's like, there's the business people over here, and they're kind of contrary to the artists, and the artists over here, and their interests were contrary to one another. But he proposed it like, no, they should be hand in hand. You should be working together. Like these are both things that have to happen in order for a book to succeed. You can't just have the art. You have to have the business side, and so you have to sort of think with both hats. And that stuck with me. I think that was a really good perspective shift. If anyone has been around artists where there's a lot of sort of negative comments about the business side as much as me, it's good to hear that and think like, okay, yeah, that's the business side is important. It has to be there if we want to succeed, if it's going to sell, right? So Um,
Yeah, especially, the contracts thing, that's a big deal because you don't want to sign away anything that you don't want to sign away. So, and there's nothing wrong with getting a lawyer prior to signing a contract. I don't think in regards to comics, I've never had to get a lawyer to sign any work made for hire contracts. When I was doing some animation stuff, we had to get a lawyer because that was kind of a big deal and, a lot of money and stuff. But there are some publishers like Image Comics, I think, is a very good example where they're very creator friendly and they know what they're doing and you own everything. And those guys are great. So Image Comics, I like them a lot.
oh, that's cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little about your actual, like, the book. So the Sword of Eden. I'm curious about, like, it's a book. It's a Christian book with superheroes, and I'm curious if, like, about the dimensions of the spiritual significance that are in that book, right? So there's a couple different ways that it seems like there's spiritual dimensions mixed in. The first one is that some of the characters are explicitly Christian characters, right? So how do you handle that, where it's not a real person with real faith, it's a fictional person with fictional faith? Do you run into any problems with that aspect of the story?
No. Now, well, the thing is, here's a couple of things. Yes, The Sword of Eden is a work of fiction, so I don't believe that there are vampires or aliens or anything like that, but you got all that stuff in there. I don't believe there's really superheroes, but that's the kind of genre that The Sword of Eden is, which just happens to be also a Christian superhero graphic novel with a lot of very strong Christian themes in it. I don't know if I can ask you if you actually read The Sword of Eden.
I started. I haven't finished it all.
Well, that was since yesterday, so it's 220 pages, so I don't blame you. It's a lot of content there.
That was right.
So, yeah. Well, the thing also is, like, in life, not everybody not everyone you care about is born again, saved, Bible-believing Christian, So with The Sword of Eden, there are people in there that are not Christians. So, and some have a journey, there you go.
Yeah. So there's an aspect of storytelling that I've heard is like, let's see, it's kind of like the idea of demonstrated good and evil. So there's some aspects of the story where someone might say out loud, this is good, or this is bad, or that is evil. But in general, we often see that the villain stands for what is evil and the good person stands for what is good. And whatever is going to be victorious in the end is what is, like, the demonstrated good in the story. Whatever is defeated ends up being the evil. So obviously you have the explicit sort of biblical idea of good and evil in your story. Is there any other, like, good or evil principles in your story that you think that it shows, that it demonstrates?
Well, I think, I have, there's an angel who he's like initially the narrator of the book to get, like, the reader on track to what's going on in the story and introduce the reader to all these different characters. And there are demons, so I don't think there's one's good, one's evil, so that's kind of simple.
Yeah, right.
But the interest, there are some characters in the book that you might think are good, but turn out not to be so good. Like there's question, like, the morality is kind of questionable. There's a character called Kid Cockroach, and he's just like this young kid who wants to be a superhero. He's got a costume. He wants to be a sidekick, and the superheroes just sort of tolerate him, but when the rubber meets the road and he's faced with a foe or a threat, he just chickens out, and he's not really that brave, although he wants to be that brave. There's a character called Ninja Spider, who's a ninja, and he's hanging out with good guys, but you really don't know. So, but some of the characters that I've read as a fan, even the ones that we look upon as villains, they themselves don't see themselves as villains. Like, you have characters like Dr. Doom or Magneto, and clearly with their actions, they are evil. But they don't think themselves as evil. Like Dr. Doom he thinks he's the best guy to run the whole planet, so that's what he wants to do. Same with Magneto. Although Magneto only cares about other mutants, and believes that he's the guy to run all the mutants who want to control the world. So they don't see themselves as villains, but clearly with their actions, they are evil. So that's kind of interesting, you know. But when you're working with demons personified, yeah, there's no good there. You know, they're clearly evil.
So that's a good example.
But also here's the thing, man. So we see a lot of like angels and demons and supernatural stuff in entertainment now, but sometimes like the demons or vampires or whatever are treated as heroes or as good. That I don't like. So with the Sword of Eden, you know, there is a character in there, Count Orlok from the old Nosferatu film, which is in public domain, so anybody can use that character.
Okay.
And I want to show that vampires are just evil. Like he's a monster. Like when you first see him, he's kind of cartoony looking, but when he becomes more of a threat, I drew him a little bit more realistic, you know, and you realize he is a monster, and vampires shouldn't be these guys running around, you know, where all the girls think they're cute, you know, so they're monsters. So monsters should be monsters.
Yeah, that's a good point. So it seems like the Tolkien version of the bad guy is that they're just pretty bad, right? They're just like the ultimate evil in Tolkien stories are very sort of the personification of evil. But like total evil. But you have like you mentioned, Magneto is a good example, or Doctor Doom, where they are sort of the personification of a specific kind of evil, right? Like I think hubris, I guess, pride might be Doctor Doom, and then Magneto might be, I don't know, another kind of pride, I guess. I'd have to think about that. But they both seem to have this idea that they are good. Their worldview is a dangerous one because it's one that everybody could fall prey to if we were not careful. Do you have any characters in your book that you feel like are representing that sort of thing, where it's not the total evil, but it's more of a like an evil that you and I might fall into and be
well, I have a very sort of black and white view on things. So I think good is good and evil is evil. So other than the examples I mentioned of those two characters in the Sword of Eden, yeah, the good guys are good guys and bad guys are bad guys, you know, so, and then you got to pick a side.
Yeah. Okay. So that brings me to the next question is like a lot of stories, there's a character arc, right? So the main character starts out in one place in the story, and usually there's some sort of flaw in them, in their way of seeing the world or the way of living. And then over the course of the story, that's challenged, right? The circumstances of the story challenge it. And in order to succeed or win and have victory at the end, they have to change that. And that's some has suggested that's the story of redemption, right? There's the fall and then redemption at the end. You have an actual like upward arc at the end, like for the win. For your characters, do you have are there any arcs like that where there is a redemption story in your book for anything?
There's a couple, but I probably can't talk about them because it would really spoil the story. But I can talk about a little bit of it. I think so. Artemin is an angel, and he tends to be a little bit more compassionate about people. And there's a young teenage girl. Her name is Rebecca Stern, and the book starts off where she's starting her first day as a superhero. So she's kind of strong, she's kind of fast, and she has this weird sort of sixth sense to sensing like supernatural things or evil things. And her view is that she wants to do God's will by fighting bad guys, fighting villains, and she's kind of rough around the edges. She's Orthodox, she's Jewish, so she's a little, you know, like I said, rough around the edges, not very compassionate, you know. But over the course of the book, I think she grows quite a bit. So there's a character called Professor Jack, and he's like the world's smartest, you know, explorer, inventor, and he has some guilt, which he tries to resolve during the course of the story as well. So that's later on.
Oh, very cool.
Yeah.
We have another question from the audience. So what do you recommend to begin Christian stories, to focus on kids, young, or adults who bought comics when they were young?
You mean in regards to the audience?
I think that's what the question is about. What
Uh,
audience do you shoot
yeah,
for?
it's weird because like the kind of story that I wanted to tell, it's really probably not for very young people, so it's recommended for preteens and older because there is some violence in it, but it's like Marvel comics, Marvel superhero violence, so there's not like a whole lot of gore. There's no gore or anything like that, but there are characters punching each other, so there's like some superhero violence in it. So I really can't recommend something like that for like a 5-year-old. So on the back of the book, it says, recommended, preteens and older. So if you like, Marvel comics, back when Marvel comics were fun and cool, I think readers would like that. But I didn't sit down and think that, like, I just wrote a story and drew a story, and I was like, well, some of this is a little intense for a very young reader. So, but I've had moms and grandmoms who bought the book, gave it to their 8-year-old, and said their 8-year-olds loved it. So you never know. I sold it some guy on Facebook. He wanted a copy for himself and his 7-year-old daughter, and he asked if it was recommended material for a 7-year-old daughter. But he said that his 7-year-old daughter is 7 and growing on to 13, and I was like, yeah, maybe just read the book with her. But I never sat down and said we're focused on the target audience first and then wrote the story, because I think that's kind of dangerous. But yeah, so, but also like, it's not for, it's weird too, because there aren't a lot of comics out there for just young readers, like the old Archie comics and that sort of thing. And I wish there was more of that, because it looks like the focus nowadays for new comics are really geared towards an older audience. But yeah, but there are things that are like, all ages. Hero Bear and the Kid, which was a comic by Mike Kunkel, which is like an all thing, or like Calvin and Hobbes, and I would probably consider that like an all ages kind of material.
Yeah, that's probably true.
But depending on what kind of story you're telling during that process, then you should probably think about your target audience. But that shouldn't reflect or control on what kind of story you want to tell.
Yeah. Now, it strikes me that like some people say like you just create your story and then look through the work and then identify who it's best pointed towards, right? Not that it will only appeal to one group, but it's usually has one or two groups that it would best connect with. So then you can work on it after you've created it to make sure that it sort of fine tune it so that it actually hits those audiences well. That's one approach, which seems to be sort of like the after you're done working, you kind of do the second draft sort of thing, and you can tailor it a little bit if you want to make an intentional effort to reach the audience better, I guess.
Well, it is important to know who your audience is, right? And once you figure out who your audience is, and then you go from there, because like initially with the Sword of Eden, yeah, it's just like, Christians loved it, so I would go to churches and do signings and stuff, and it was wonderful. And again, it's always nice to feel important, so there's that, and we'll see how things work out with the comic book stores, those sales and everything. So yeah, I'm just looking forward to everything. It's great. But yeah, you make a very good point. You really need to understand who your audience is, and then go there.
Yeah.
Find out how to reach them with the least amount of effort too.
Maybe speak a little bit more about that. That seems like might be that might be helpful.
Well, I think nowadays, because there was a time, before the interweb, where, and if you wanted to work in comics, you were either work for Marvel or DC. And then like, late 70s and 1980s, or like small publishers that might publish creator-owned material. But now, like with the internet, like even not only just in comics, but animation or making music, and you could create content and give it directly to your audience, and there's no one else that is between you and your audience. So again, like I mentioned, Amazon. So if you have your own book, sell it through Amazon. That's the place to go. If you're creating music or movies or film or whatever, get a YouTube channel and go on there. And you're not going to have an editor or a producer telling you how to write or draw or create your own art. You just do it yourself, and you can work directly and get that material to your audience. And if you can do that as easily as possible, it's better for you and your audience. So yeah.
Yeah, that actually brings up another question I have is like, so in the old days, there's a lot of gatekeepers. Some of them were editors, right? And there would be a lot
Yeah,
of, cooks in the kitchen trying to make sure that
yeah,
now, not most of those, like you're just describing, those are largely gone. If you want to go straight to the audience through Amazon, you can do that. And there's upsides and downsides. Some of the downsides I've seen are it's not too uncommon to find a book that's on Amazon that has like all kinds of editing problems. There's like there's grammar and language and stuff that are just not well done, right? And where in the old days there would have been an editor who would have checked all those things. Nowadays it's just the person could just put it on up for sale however they want. Um, so now it's like if you're the creator and you're working on it yourself, it's easy to write a story. I mean, I've done this with papers for school where you look at it and it looks great to you. You've read it 3 or 4 times. Everything looks great. And you turn it in, and then you like the audience, the other audience, someone with another perspective reads it and they see all the flaws. So it's hard to be as the creator aware of any flaws. It's hard to be your own editor. So if you were to say like as an individual creator who's trying to create something that is quality, and yet there's no system that's forcing you to have editors and people like that to critique your work. What's a good way for individual creators to gain the feedback that will help them to create quality work in an environment where that's not imposed on them? Does that make sense?
yes. So what I do, God has blessed me with many friends. So I have one friend, and she proofreads all my stuff. So the Sword of Eden, she proofread everything. She is very fond of literature, and she was great. And she understood even like dialogue, like accents. So I have a couple of different characters in the Sword of Eden, like Count Orlok. He's kind of got a Romanian kind of accent. So I gave her like his dialogue, and she was able to write it in such a way where when you read Count Orlok's dialogue, it reads exactly how he sounds when he's talking. So it's good to have a lot of friends, Jeff. So, and I have a couple of buddies that, if I'm questioning something, I'm not quite sure what to do about something, I'll go to them. So I got like 3 very close friends. One I've known since I was a kid, and a couple other guys that are, into like, the Marvel movies and anime and, some comic book stuff. So I'm always talking to them about stuff, and they'll critique and they'll give me their opinions on things. And yeah, and that's been very, very helpful. So yeah, if you're married, give the material to your wife or husband and have them look at it and, catch whatever flaws or spelling errors you have, or, talk to your friends about it, or show them copies or printouts of your work while you're working on it. And then have them critique it and let you know how they feel about things.
Yeah. So that we're getting kind of into the creator process side of things. Like, have you, as you've been a Christian and a creative person pursuing your craft, along that journey, have you run into any aspects of the creative process that your faith has either presented as an additional challenge to, or made it easier, or removed obstacles that other people face? Has your faith added something that would otherwise not have been there that you're aware of?
I am most happy working on the Sword of Eden graphic novel series, and where I believe that because God has blessed my life and my career, that I'm giving back to Him. So that makes me very happy. So that's great. If you're referring to like the time when I was working for like Archie or DC or Marvel and stuff, there are a couple of moments where things have gotten really bad, I think, in my opinion, in the comic book industry, in the secular side of the comic book industry, which is almost all of it, for people that are either Christian or very conservative. Because I think there's a lot of agendas going on, and a lot of modern comic books. On a personal level, I've had a couple of problems with like at least one editor that I knew, because like when I would email people, when I normally email people, I'll sign off, like Thomas Jefferson did when he was president, "In Christ Jesus," and then I'll write Al Nickerson, and then I'll put some scripture at the bottom. So I had one editor. I met up with him at the New York Comic Con one year, several years ago, and he told me to stop putting scripture in my emails to him because it made him feel uncomfortable. And I refused to do that. And yeah, so he wasn't particularly happy with me. As a teacher, because I teach at a college, and it's a very liberal college, and sometimes it's like being in a snake pit. But as Jesus told us to be salt and light within the world. So I take that as a challenge, not, as an educator, to be in a classroom full of, well, I usually don't have problems with students. Actually, one year, one of the students started this conversation about Pokemon and asked if I thought that Pokemon was satanic or not. We got in this long conversation about the gospel and, things like the shack. And it was wonderful. And all the students were great. They're mostly very curious about how I saw things. But, management, yeah, they're not very Christian friendly. So, yeah. So they told me the same thing, not to include, scripture in my emails to, through my college email. And I refused to do that.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And they're supposed to be very tolerant and inclusive. So, yeah.
Right. So then it sounds like those are some challenges that are kind of with people that are like external to you. Have you had any instances where you had an internal struggle in your creative process because of your faith?
No. What do you mean?
Well, it seems to me that there are some artists who, it's true for me, and it seems to be true for people I know, where at some point they realize that the art that they're producing might have an impact on the world at large, and they start to be concerned that it might cause others to stumble or something, have some impact that's negative. And that's just an example of something that someone might consider if they're a Christian, if they're a believer, that you probably wouldn't consider so much if you weren't. So something like that. Is there ever been a concern that you ran into that sort of presented a challenge in your creative work?
I don't think so. The only thing that I could, not really, no. There's a couple things going through my head right now, but they're really kind of minor. Like, I never really struggled with the story or the content or anything. If I had any questions about certain things, then I'll talk to my buddies about it and they would give me advice. There's one scene in the book that's a little intense. But I drew it in a way where it wasn't graphic at all. It looks just like two people like on a stage, so you don't see anything in the background or anything. But that scene in the book, I think, I was told it is kind of very intense. But graphically, it looks fine. But the actual what's really happening, yeah, that's what I was told. But I don't think I ever struggled. Like, are you saying like, when you're creating a story or whatever, or a drawing, and it might be too, I don't know the kind of word to use, where you think that a Christian audience might not like it?
I think it actually, I'm not thinking of anything specific. Maybe a different way to approach it would be like, do you have any rules for yourself in how you create that have something to do with like what your faith?
There are certain comics I like, and all right, yeah, actually I have it. All right, so the Sword is the kind of comic that I would like to read. So there's no nudity, there's no vulgarity. Like, I have a demon that kind of says made up, kind of like he'll say like stinky socks or something like that, or so. I wasn't going to put any cursing in the work. I wasn't going to use any of those weird symbols where the reader might just think of something that's not really nice. So that character would just say things that were kind of silly. So that's the only thing I can think of. But yeah, the kind of comics I like tend not to be risque or vulgar, so that's not the kind of work that I want to create myself. So
sure, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So we're getting close to the end here. Do you if you were going to give advice to somebody, like maybe say like looking back to your younger self, and you're going to give yourself some like 3 pieces of advice, what would you give your younger self, or someone who's trying to follow a similar path?
Well, well, here's a couple of things. Well, when I was in college, I wish I had recorded like all of my instructors' lectures. That would have been kind of cool. Um, you know, I had a pretty good grasp on work made for hire and what that was all about, even when I stepped into it. So, but again, I'm just repeating myself, saying that yeah, you should, if you want to work in art, have a good understanding of contracts and the business side of art.
Right.
And be persistent. You got to be hungry for it. You got to really like to draw, and you're going to get a lot of rejection letters. So, when you're submitting work to Marvel or DC or Archie to a specific editor and you get a rejection letter or rejection, email, don't let that deter you. So just keep creating art. And as long as you keep creating art and you're smart about things, yeah, things will work out fine.
So did you do anything in particular, like to encourage yourself if in the moments when you were getting rejected? Like, did you think of anything, or did you have any kind of processes that you used to?
I think it motivated me to just do better art and to work more and to hone my craft a little bit more. So yeah, I mean, some of the editors were great and they gave me some really good advice. I actually had mentioned Terry Austin earlier. So when I was in high school, he was an inker at Marvel and worked on the Uncanny X-Men comic. Yeah. So right before I started working in comics, I met Terry Austin at a comic book convention in New York. And he looked at my samples, like Xerox copies of my work. And so this is the guy that really inspired me to become an inker. So he's looking at my samples and he's like, you really need to learn how to use your tools better. And I was a little disappointed, but the thing is, he was right. He was absolutely right. So yeah, so so what he was saying really was that I need to vary my line more with a brush and learn how to use a nib a little bit better. So I felt a little bad after, this guy who I really admired, who wasn't really particularly happy at my art samples, but he gave me good advice and he was absolutely right. So
that's cool.
It doesn't help anybody, like even when I'm teaching, it doesn't help anybody if you don't point out things that, where they're making mistakes, because they don't know their mistakes and they might not want to, get better in their craft.
So that's a really good question. It seems to me that there's real value in actually getting critique. Like in this case, it seems like you benefited from it. But there's it seems like there's a way to give it critique that could be received better, easier, and ways to give it where it can be, more discouraging. Do you have any suggestions for people who are giving critique to others on how to do that in a way that's constructive and is more encouraging to improve rather than discouraging?
Well, my philosophy usually is don't be a jerk. So you can be a jerk on both ends, right? So you could be an editor and looking at work and you could be a jerk. So yeah, don't do that. If you start working in comics or animation, don't be a jerk, be nice to everybody, hand in your work on time. So I think that's important. Also, if you do want to do work for hire and you want to work for Marvel or DC or Archie, and you're going to a convention or submitting your samples to an editor or publisher, make sure that whatever samples you're sending to that particular publisher, that you're using those characters and you're drawing those characters in that art style. Because I remember I was at the New York Comic Con another time, and my editor-in-chief at Archie Comics was there, Victor Gorlick. He passed away a couple years ago. And I was talking to Victor, and this young kid came up with his portfolio. And he had an agent with him as well. It was really weird. So I kind of stepped aside, and then, so this young kid is showing, Victor Gorlick, editor-in-chief at Archie Comics, all of his sample work, but it was like all superhero stuff. It was like, Marvel characters, DC characters. And Victor's looking at everything and he's like, it's like, I can't tell how well you would draw our characters because all I see is superhero stuff. So if you're going to submit stuff to Archie Comics, make sure, you're drawing those characters in that kind of style, because it doesn't help an editor. Like, how can he hire you if all you have is like Superman and Batman pages in your portfolio if you're going to the editor-in-chief of Archie Comics? So you got to suit your portfolio to whomever's going to be looking at your work. And also, so if you want to draw Spider-Man, find out who the editor of Spider-Man is and just draw a bunch of Spider-Man samples and contact them. So
Now, has it changed? I mean, I've heard that like last time there was a time when going to comic conventions, you bring your stuff and you'd be able to sit down with actual editors. It seems like that's changing now, where it's harder to actually talk to a real editor. You might get someone else lower down the food chain. Have you had any experience with that, or is that?
I mean, I usually see editors at, when I go to New York Comic Con. One thing to keep in mind is that they're not going to take anything home with them that you give them. So having a business card might be a good idea, and because that's something easy that they can take with them. But if you have samples of your work, they're not going to take that, from you and cart that all the way back home after the con and stuff.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, especially like something like the New York Comic Con, it's 4 days long. You will have editors there, but you'll have like assistant editors there as well. So yeah, it's just, network is important, and having a business card is very important, and showing samples of your work is very, very important as well. But don't expect anybody to take some of your stuff home with them, because that's not going to happen.
That makes sense.
And get a business card from them as well, so that way you can do a follow-up email or whatever.
Right. Yeah. So it seems like a pretty. I've heard someone say this, and it seems like a pretty good call as well. Is that like at a con, a lot of times there'll be panels with the editors on the panel, and if you're interested in listening or working with an editor, just listening to the panel and like paying attention to what that editor says, like what do they like or not like, can give you a sense of like this is what their sensibilities are. So yeah,
do whatever they tell you to do. If you want to draw Spider-Man, do whatever they ask you to do. Learn how to draw webbing, stuff like that, and cities and stuff. But yeah, ultimately you should be able to be drawing from life anyway. So you should learn how to draw people and cars and trees and buildings and stuff. And then after that, especially like if you want to be an animator for Disney, they could always teach you how to draw like Mickey Mouse or whatever. But Disney really would want to look at your work where you're actually showing talent where you can draw from life. So that's more important. Get a sketchbook, start drawing stuff in your sketchbook.
So is there any skills that you've seen over the years that you've been working that like younger artists are lacking that you think is like a really important thing that younger artists could focus on that they don't seem to be focusing on?
I think the big thing, especially in comics, is like you got to know how to tell a story using illustrations. I think that's the biggest flaw. If you could draw well, you could draw covers well, or splash pages or pinups, but if you can't tell a story, you're not going to be able to get a job in comics. When you're creating comics, if the reader has to stop and figure out what a panel looks like or where their eye should go next from one panel to the next, you've lost your reader there. And then they come out of that and they realize they're reading a comic. So you just want to make sure everything's nice and clear, that you're telling a story properly, and your reader's not going to be confused by things. So that's one thing. So that's very important in regards to anyone who wants to work where they're creating comics. Another thing is lettering. Like my students, they don't really know how to letter very well. So what I usually do is have them hand letter things. So that way they kind of know the basics. But you got to understand that lettering is a very important aspect of your artwork. So you got to have enough room for all your lettering. All your lettering and word balloons have to be placed in the right spot. So, and you got to consider, so when you're laying out a page, you got to be very much aware about where the word balloons are going to go, how much that character is talking, so there's enough space left over. But now, like, because I do all my lettering in Photoshop, so I, draw my artwork on Bristol board, pen and ink, scan it in, do all my lettering in Photoshop, do all my coloring and gray tones in Photoshop. So that's very handy. And now with all the various different fonts we have now for lettering, yeah, lettering looks great if you do it right.
Yeah, but it seems like we're talking to Sergio Cariello, and he was talking about laying out your panel layouts and putting the planning out where your word balloons are going to go as part of that layout. And it seems like,
yeah,
I mean, I've drawn really nice pages and then tried to put the panels on, put the balloons on, and it's like, oh man, nothing fits,
No, you gotta compose a page with all that stuff in mind. You can't just start drawing a lot of pretty, panels and then try to fit the word balloons in. So I don't know if you're aware of Winsor McKay. He did Little Nemo and Slumberland.
Yes,
like early 1900s. His artwork was gorgeous, but all the lettering was terrible. Like the words were touching the word balloons and stuff. So I don't know if he was doing the lettering himself or had an assistant who did the lettering. So it seems kind of clear he wasn't thinking about word balloons in his lettering when he was actually drawing his pages. So yes, so lettering is very important, and it's got to be part of your artwork and your composition.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, well, we are at time. Before we go, is there anything else that sticks out to you that would be important you want to mention to the audience?
Well, again, I want to focus on the fact that, I'm creating the Sword of Eden to create Christian content for a Christian audience, and also sharing the gospel message and letting people know that Jesus suffered and died on a cross for the sins of people, and he rose again. And anyone who repents and believes in him will be made righteous in the eyes of God. And Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one can come to the Father but by me. So that message is the most important message. And yeah, if you want to be right by God, it's very important to, repent and believe in the Savior and put your faith and trust in him, and find, a really good Bible teaching church family somewhere. Like, I love my church family. They're wonderful. And we study the word of God, and we worship together and pray together. And it's fantastic. So, because we're all going to step in eternity someday. So you just want to make sure, that you're made right in the eyes of God, and only through Christ Jesus can you be made right in the eyes of God.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And for anyone who would like to try to find you or follow you online after this, where would people find you?
Yeah, again, theswordofeden.com. So a lot of good stuff there. And yeah, you can purchase the book through various different means, like I mentioned before. And there are links to my Facebook page and my Twitter account. So yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate
it. And thank you guys too, because you guys are great. So I love you guys. So thank you so much, Jeff. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Awesome. And also thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for giving your questions and comments. For more information about the Christian Comic Arts Society, check out our website at christiancomicarts.com. And you can tune in 2 weeks. We're going to do another panel that we're going to be talking about the Suicide Squad and any Christian commentary or spiritual or eternal themes that we find in that. We'll see. So, all right, join us then. If you'd like to join us again, you can find us right back here. And everybody have a great week or 2 weeks. Take care.